Yeah, now I want to go ahead and I want to transition again to the final panel of the forum. I'll come back at the end just to give a few details around tomorrow's interactive boot camp, but I want to bring in Laurie Barkman, who's going to be the moderator for the last session, and then obviously I'll give her a chance to introduce her three panelists. But Laurie and I have known each other for a long time. One of the things I tell people often about Laurie is, like, when I had this idea for CSL, I think Laurie was one of the first calls that I made. Maybe I think actually was the first call that I made on this, but we've known each other for a long time. We've collaborated in a number of different ways. Most recently, I twisted her arm to come on to the faculty at Carnegie Mellon as an adjunct instructor and help us teach the Corporate Startup Lab project course that we teach together with Melissa Murphy, who you had a chance to meet yesterday. So Laurie teaches that with myself and Melissa. She also does a number of other things, including runs one of the most interesting podcasts out there today. So if you're not subscribed to her podcast, Succession Stories, you should go to iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts, subscribe. And the way you do that, I believe, is you subscribe and then immediately give it a 5-star rating. I think that's how you subscribe to these things. If you could do both of those things, that would be great. Anyways, I asked her, though, today to put together a panel on some of the lessons from these family-led businesses. And she's put together just an incredible set of panelists around this. We've got a 2nd generation, 4th generation, and 6th generation family group here. So I guess you had to be an even generation family member to join. But I'll have Laurie introduce them and kick off the last of our panels. And then we'll have one more startup spotlight and also go over the details for the boot camp. So Laurie, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Sean. And I should say it was not a hard arm twist to get me to say yes to become faculty. And I really appreciate the opportunity. I am a proud Tepper alum. And also my daughter goes to Carnegie Mellon. So I have a full 360 appreciation for Carnegie Mellon these days. One of the reasons for this panel, and I think it ties so well with some of the earlier conversations today from Alex Osterwalder especially, and as we think about companies and all the changes that we've gone through in the last year and a half, so much has accelerated in the market, so many dynamics at play. But if you just take a step back and we say, who is innovation for? It's really for many companies, and the numbers bear out that 60% of the United States workforce is employed by a family-owned company. And so if family-owned businesses are not thinking about innovating or dying, we are in trouble as a nation, and our GDP will be in trouble. So we are motivated as owners of these companies to do something different. And that's why I'm so excited to introduce the panel today, because these are 3 next-gen leaders who are motivated to do something different in their companies. And so I'll introduce them briefly, but they're going to introduce themselves. And as Sean mentioned, I have a podcast. All 3 of them have been guests on my show. I've been so lucky to get to know them through that forum. And I've heard their stories at length. I would encourage all of you to do so as well. I'll share the episode numbers with you. 44 is Chris, and 40 is Kent, and 65 is Tricia, if you're so interested to find them. So firstly, introductions. Christopher Yanakos, he's the 2nd generation president of a company called Reignite. Very interesting story. The interview was with he and his father, so I have a very good perspective about that company's transition to the next generation. Kent Johnson is the 4th generation chief executive officer of Highlights for Children. If anyone remembers them fondly from when you were a kid, as I do, hopefully you are smiling right now, and Kent will share his story. And then last but not least, Tricia Staible. She is the 6th generation president of Robinson Fans. And these are not your desk fans. These are huge truck size industrial fans in major industrial applications. And so welcome to the podium, the virtual podium, all 3 of you. So we'll just get started with some introductions. I think it's interesting for you to share not only who you are, your company, but let's talk about your transition into the company. Let's set the stage for the cultural environment that you encountered when you were coming in. And Tricia, we're going to start with you.
Sure.
Tell us about your journey.
Yeah, so obviously sixth generation. I actually started my career as an attorney. I worked for 4 years with the law firm of Dorsey and Whitney. And that kind of matters because it also tells you about my transition to the company. So while I was at the law firm, we did a consolidation of shareholders. So my dad really led that consolidation. My grandfather and his brother were a 50-50 split on ownership. And so we ended up buying out my great uncle's side of the family and a few other shareholders. So the setting of the stage for me to come into the family business was somewhat wide open. My dad had spent so much time focusing on navigating that family dynamic that then it wasn't a gap, but it also wasn't as though I had something to really come up against. My grandfather's top-down type leadership that was in place before. My dad wasn't and isn't a top-down leader, but he also had been so busy with the family dynamic that I would say there wasn't anything for me to too directly come up against, and said instead it was almost an open invitation for, okay, let's see what you can do with this. So
Okay, thanks for sharing that. And Kent, how about for you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, for most of you remember the magazine. I had a non-linear journey to join the company. So I like to say I did everything I could in my life to not join the family business. So my first love was science. I taught high school physics. I ended up getting a PhD in physics and was minding my own business in biotech, having a wonderful time in what's thought of, I think, as a much more innovative space than children's publishing. When I sort of was bitten by the bug with planted seeds, my uncle, as I went through a stint on the board of directors and realized there was a lot of interesting challenges in children's publishing. So I transitioned and moved into the business after a completely different career path. And certainly entered for all of us in family businesses, there's a tradition, a heritage to the business. Our company was started by my great grandparents back in 1946. So we're 75 years young at this point. And I came into an organization where our CEO, my mother's cousin, had been in his role for 23, 24 years. And the business was doing pretty well. So the culture was one of sort of execution, top-down management, excellence at publishing, and direct marketing, direct-to-consumer marketing. So it really was an environment of doing the same thing, but trying to do it a little bit better all the time. So from my perspective, to come in and say, okay, we're okay now, but we clearly are going to have to change because of the incredible disruption around technology and consumer behavior. We're going to have to think about ourselves differently, conceptualize who we are and what we want to be in order to create sort of the motivation and the understanding to move forward in new ways with new products. So it was a very interesting environment. Fortunately, we had a great team in place. I can talk about my transition maybe later, but I was able to come in and not have to do things under the time pressure of a crisis. But it has been a journey of change for me in the 16 years since I took over.
Yeah, and really the cultural aspect is kind of the underpinning tone of this question, because all of you are coming into your companies at different stages. Chris, for you, you're the second generation. So your father was the one who launched the company. Maybe tell us your journey.
Sure. So thanks, Laurie. I'm Chris Yanakos, president of Rely. Our journey was a little bit different because we were originally based around direct care facilities for occupational injuries. And we have since changed so that we can provide the best quality occupational injury care in over 40 states. And we do that using really interesting IT framework, as well as some predictive analytics. So when I came in, just a completely different company. But we were a company that had very hard boundaries on growth. The first being capital. To open 40 states worth of medical care clinics is a very expensive move. And part of the idea of the innovation there was to begin thinking about how we might do this differently. So In general, if I were to sum up what we do as an organization, which is way harder than going after Kent because he can just hold up Highlights magazine. And here I am trying to describe a niche business in healthcare, but we're trying to improve the quality of care, improve the efficiency of that care delivery, which also has the added benefit of decreasing cost.
Well, we just had the pleasure of listening to two gentlemen innovators in the healthcare space, including Optum. So I think that it's actually quite a nice dovetail, Chris. So they set it up well for you. And imagine, Tricia, you can't really show us one of your industrial fans here. That's not as easy as the Highlights magazine.
No, but we have become innovative, and I should have thought ahead to have that to show you, because that I can actually pick up. But I'll talk about that later.
Yeah. So why don't we go back? We'll jump back to we'll go back to Kent, and I think it is important to set the stage for innovation. What were some of the expectations around you coming into the company? I know there was a transition. Everyone's got their own transition story, and it's a fascinating thing on the episodes when we have time to go deep to really talk about some of those dynamics. But this idea that you're going to come in as the new leader and you're not going to mess anything up. We don't want you to mess anything up. You got to run the status quo. You got to do the playbook. Hey, it's worked for Tricia in your case. It's worked for 5 gens, right? Or Kent, it's worked for the 3 before you. So don't F it up. Right. That's kind of a very common theme in these succession stories. So what was the dynamic when you came into the company? And at what point did you feel like you were ready to, when you got the baton, to move it forward in the way that you saw fit?
Yeah, no, it's a check. So I came in around July of 2004, and I had no experience in children's publishing. I'd been on the board for 2 years, so I'd learned something about the company. But I came into a role in strategic planning with the idea that there'd be a gradual transition, that I'd be trained by my predecessor and the team in place. And maybe that's a 5-year process. But life doesn't always work out that way. So my predecessor died suddenly in January of 2005. And so the board put me in as CEO. I'm age 36. I've got all of 7 minutes. It felt like 7 minutes, 7 months of experience in the industry. And so the board was very good at back, like you said, they probably didn't say don't F it up, but they said, look, you don't need a 90-day plan. Like, we're okay. You need to take your time. You have 2 jobs. You've got to learn these industries. You've got to do some thinking, learn the teams, learn how to be a CEO. Those are your 2 jobs. And then we're going to, over time, figure out what needs to be changed. So I was lucky, because even in place as a CEO, I had several years really to get an understanding and develop an approach to sort of start moving the needle around the company culture and what we were doing. So, that was the process. And, somehow I'm still here 15 years later, so it's worked. But it is kind of, I think the other thing I'd add, in a family business, I think we inherit certain values, certain pieces of the culture, and there's an aspect that the family behind the business, there's certain things they don't want to change. And I think that sometimes drifts out of the things that we really care about being stewards of and holding constant, and it drifts into other things. So it's one of the things, we don't want to change our values and our culture, but to have that leak to, well, we don't want to change our business model or our products. So a lot of it is about being really clear about what you don't want to change, so that everything else can be open to question and change and destruction and disruption.
And Tricia, for you, there was a dynamic with your father, as you mentioned earlier, where he was convinced one way or the other to take a step back. And it was not an easy time for you when you came in. Can you just set the stage for us when you got the baton? And were you under the impression of, hey, just keep things status quo? Or did you get a sense of the culture that there was an openness to do something different, and a culture that supported innovation?
Yeah, one thing I forgot to mention about working at the law firm, I was a trial attorney. So the good and bad of that is that I like to argue. And I think Laurie's referring to perhaps something written about me that basically said I went in and demanded some things, which is true. I mean, I tend to be impatient and want to see results of what I envision quickly. At the same time, I'm thankful I wasn't dumped in like Kent. That sounds a bit terrifying. So when I came on board, my goal was work enough on the shop floor to understand the product and my teammates who worked there and what they really wanted to see happen. But also I started working for the company in the Utah office, which was nice because it's a full manufacturing facility, but it's smaller. And then I tried to make kind of strategic friendships with others of similar age across the company in the different facilities. And the reason for that was I really wanted to get a feel for what everybody hoped to see for the company, what they saw as the strengths, and then kind of leverage from there. My, I guess, big move to change the culture was really to go from the top down to more of a collaborative approach. It's kind of the way I operate. I like to have all angles of a problem argued about, if you will, or discussed before something is put in place. And I think the response or the pushback that I most often received was either we've already tried that and it didn't work, or that'll never go. The people here are so used to being told what to do, nobody will ever learn how to do that. And I just, had that impatient, persistent energy and commitment. So I just barreled on through.
Did you ask for permission at that point? Did you need permission?
I think I kind of demanded it.
That's what I figured you'd say. So Chris, I'm going to jump over to you, and I have the benefit of knowing this story because it was a story you shared with your father, and it was also very interesting to have both of you giving your perspectives in the interview on this particular situation, and you know where I'm going here. So the question is around being a disruptive successor. What does that mean? It's a next generation leader who sees that they need to change the status quo to keep the business relevant, to keep it current. You proposed something to your father and he pooped on it. What was that story?
Sure. So when I entered the company, we were very slow at adopting technology. And when I mean really slow, I mean we lost out on our domain name way back when. We did things by pen and paper. And so after I had made some incremental change in the technology, which at the time, as we all know, if you do incremental change correctly, it can feel really innovative where you're really just updating the process. I realized that we had collected a lot of data over the last 20 years, and that because workers' compensation injuries are different than regular healthcare industries, we're about 150 billion of almost 5 trillion now. They resolve more slowly. In fact, usually by 2, 3, 4, 500% longer. They have extra surgeries. They have a higher rate of opiate abuse. So there are all these things that we're seeing in workers' comp that aren't a problem somewhere else. And I said, you know what? If we dug into this data, we did some machine learning, and we started using the diagnosis codes and some other key points and parameters, that we would be able to get more transparency out of that treatment process. So my father and I are in a car doing a sales trip, which we often did together. And for 3 hours straight, with only one break to talk about how Richard Nixon screwed up his presidency, we talked about how that would never work. How you couldn't do it, how this, how a file had to be managed by hand and massaged, and there was no other transparency that you could bring to that process other than through your experience. And so probably we'll say this again before we're done. In terms of innovation, if you are not being told by someone that it is impossible, you're really not talking about an innovative idea. You're talking about an incremental change. So after 3 hours of being told I couldn't do it, I formed a small research group out of our IT team, did some R&D using graduate students from Duquesne. I don't think CMU returned my calls at the time. And we were able to produce in very short order, in 6 months, at least a framework that proved, in fact, we could do that. So in terms of family culture, it's a little bit different with a second generation, because a family culture in a second generation, you don't have all of this history, right? You're right up against the founder. You're right up against the entrepreneur. And so you're really still even trying to develop the culture that will guide the company for, the next 10, 20 years.
Thanks for sharing that story. Tricia, we're going to go to you on this question, just a little bit different angle, because you did talk a little bit about some of the characteristics of how you were challenging the previous generation's way of running the company. But we have to acknowledge this company is 115 years old, right? And
128, I think.
128. Okay, I'm getting it right. Sorry. So it's been around a while. It's been around and it has a way of doing things. Can you share a little bit about an innovation initiative that you've taken on within the business that's helped evolve the product, the services that you provide?
Absolutely. So one of the big pushes within the industry right now, and we're hearing it in lots of different areas, is greater and greater efficiency. One of my family members, actually 2 of my family members, were our head engineers, which means they were the technical know-how behind the designs that we had at that time. And they assured me there was no way we were going to get any more efficiency out of the fans that they had over-engineered and overbuilt, right? These were the best, the top of the line. And so as we were being pushed, we, by regulatory bodies and all that sort of stuff, companies, customers, we had to figure out how to bring technology in a way that we could find those secrets, unlock the secrets, and make that visible. And the fun thing is I called CMU and they actually responded. So that was good news. We talked with them about, no, sorry, Chris. You only have to have 125 years and then they answer your call.
Plus I went to CATS, so that's also a problem.
Yeah, that's probably it. So we started looking at different testing mechanisms, and in order to test faster, used some of the things we were learning from 3D printing. So we had tried to jump straight to metallurgical printing, which was the part where we were really looking at CMU. And then we realized, wait, there are all of these cheap kind of polymer 3D printers. What if we could use those to help us get to quicker testing? Well, that changed the whole realm of possibility, because under our industry standards, you had to have a certain size of a fan model to test and get the results that they would certify. So we had to basically go and prove that we could test with something smaller and not build out of metal and actually get the results. And that allowed us to innovate design at a pace that was incredible. We were no longer fighting production to get time to build a metal fan. And now we were able to print, within a week, something that we could test and then use calculations to get to our results. It made, as Chris said, kind of our whole process more transparent, because we could finally see behind our designs in new ways. So
it's such a great example, because we talk about testing as a really key component of new product development, innovation, getting it out to the marketplace. You're saying the testing was even more important at this stage because there's technical advances that have to be proven out that you needed to do. So it really shortened the lead time, and it probably saved a lot of cost. So thanks for sharing that example. I'm going to jump over to Kent. Kent, we had talked about a particular innovation group that you had started, and some of the innovations that have come out of that group. And I think the cultural aspect of it, and as you as a newer leader, but now you've been in this role 7+ years, are you a disruptive successor? And can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I hope I don't know if I remember the exact right story. I got so distracted as my excited physicist side wants to talk more about fan design and testing. So that was super cool. It's interesting. One of the things that you come in and what a company thinks it matters a lot. So, I've spent a lot of time, and I used to shock people. I'd say internally, externally, we're not a magazine company. Don't think of us as a magazine company, because fundamentally it's a pretty bad business model to have a children's magazine. It's high customer cost of acquisition and direct to consumer. They grow out of it very quickly. And by the way, we don't carry any advertising, so there's no revenue stream there. So it's a horrible business model. Don't get into this business. That being said, we also knew one of the rules you could never challenge was the only way that business model works is if you cover the largest age range you can with the magazine. Let's imagine they start at 2 and they stay till they're 12. That's what my great grandparents imagined. In our modern world, that's not something that makes any sense to anyone. So a pretty significant change under my watch was moving from one magazine and fundamentally moving lower and thinking of the company serving kids down to birth. So first launching a preschool magazine and then a baby magazine so that we could talk to parents not about being a subscriber to Highlights magazine, but we want to have them think of themselves becoming a Highlights family. So starting early and then transitioning up. And that, in essence, that was a bet the company kind of shift in the business model. And so that was a whole set of stories. And the idea that we now have about 1 million subscribers in a magazine designed for kids who don't yet fully know how to read is kind of astounding. But I think another thing was happening that change enabled for us is at the same time, we're looking at the world and saying, well, we're not a magazine company. Our mission is to create content and experiences that are engage, delight, and create joyful learning. So if we don't think about just the magazine and we think about the digital transformation happening in the world, and what if we thought of all that content that we're creating as going into a digital asset management system to be reused in many different ways? And the piece about going younger opened up to us a whole world, literally, of English language learners. So we then got involved in preparing all the digital asset management, the tagging, recording everything in good English audio so that a non-English speaker could consume it both audio and visual and on paper or on screen, and spent a fair bit of time traveling around the world. And now every one of our magazines, when it's published in the US, just to give you an idea of how small the world is, at the same time it's published in China, going to Chinese kids with a talking pen that all they do is touch an article and it's read to them by someone who recorded that in Northeast Pennsylvania. So the disruption around technology and mostly outside the US, we're not a magazine company. Mostly we're a partner with digital platforms for English language learning, because we think of ourselves as like a content engine, as an aid to child development more than a specific product line. So that gives you a flavor. I think the key has been raising the level of how we think about what's the definition of the company, the mission, the purpose of our company, and then allowing everything else to change.
Yeah, and one of the things that you had told me on the show, Kent, was that you think about the company not about in the mission and vision and its values and how you as a leader are today, but you want the company to see itself in this sustainable future. And I'm not quite as eloquent in saying it as you are, but do you recall sharing that with me?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think in a family business, we're stewards. So I'm a believer in the family enterprise, in the power of sort of values, stakeholder-driven capitalism to create good in the world for our customers, our employees, our partners. So I'm a huge believer in that, and in the idea of stewardship and sustainability. So I feel like we have all the pressure that startup people have, like every month, every week, every day, we've got to execute. The pressure to change is incredible. But at the same time, in the family business context, if you think about an evergreen company or how you want it to last, there's a deliberate aspect of my job that's deliberately trying to build that purpose and mission into the DNA of the company. So how do you create a culture that allows and supports and enables innovation in all those things that can change, but also maintains those things you really value about your company? Because I think people struggle with that. If we're trying to maintain something, but at the same time we're open to disruption and change, there's like a tension to that. So, and I think in a family, like if I wanted to, one legacy in the company is to leave in the DNA the ability to innovate and disrupt, but also the commitment to maintain the values and the purpose at the highest level, but change everything else.
And that I brought it up for a reason. The presentation from Alex Osterwalder earlier today, he talked about characteristics of an invincible company, and invincible in the sense that, hey, it's maybe not possible to truly be invincible, but there were certain characteristics he talked about. One of which at the end, he said, to be having an impact and measuring the impact and making that impact purposeful, and then tying it to business results. And so in a family business, there's this larger mission for a company like yours, Kent, which is about education and the care of our children, our future children, and Christopher in the healthcare space, and Tricia for you. I mean, it's all kinds of safety related things that your fans are helping keep people alive, right? There's this larger purpose. And so I wanted just to tie it back to that. But related, I'm going to go back to Tricia for a second, and all of you, we'll go around the horn. This sense of small bets versus big bets, in these privately held companies, we haven't talked about your revenues or, and I'm not asking you to divulge any confidential information. But yeah, I mean, these are, we'll call it mid-market companies. Is that fair? Sometimes we're in the lower middle market, but generally we're in the middle market here, what we're saying. So we don't have the deepest pockets, and we have resources that are limited: time, money, and people. And so how do you choose which projects to work on? And do you choose these small bets and you look to get a percentage of them that hit and that work, and we measure along the way? Or do you say, hey, we're going all in on this one thing, and then this is why? And you might have answers that vary across that spectrum. So Tricia, we'll start with you, and then we'll go Chris and then Kent.
One of the things we've tried to do, I'd say over the last maybe 8 years, is come up with experiments that aren't as expensive, and they're ways to try out even the most expensive ideas. So for instance, at one point, I felt that our rapid response group, which is our quick turn aftermarket business, was at odds with our longer term production getting out the door. So the emergency work was coming in the same door that the long-term work was going out of. So they were always fighting each other. So rather than take the time and spend the money to move everything from one point to another and see how that went, we just did mock-ups, and we tried different ways of, experimenting with it, whether it looked like building big cardboard boxes and putting those in places on the shop floor to say, okay, this is immovable, now you have to walk around this, how's that work? Or just drawings that we walked ourselves through. We've done that with quite a few things, and just tried to mock up the idea and experiment our way through it to then decide, okay, which one's really going to get us the bang for the buck? And we do that even with big, if we buy a new robotics machine or a new CNC machine or a new whatever, we'll mock it up and try to see how much we can put through that investment in advance. So you can't limit it to just the small dollar things, but you got to find an inexpensive way to figure out what big dollar things make the most sense, I guess.
Great. Chris?
So I talked a lot earlier about the IT innovation and framework that we built, but a great example of innovation that actually saves the company money is also possible. So at the time, we were only operating in Pennsylvania. I realized that if we decentralized using contract providers, we could in fact provide the same quality of care anywhere in the country as we could right outside of our clinics. And so that capital barrier that I talked about earlier that kept us from growing, right? I can't open 200 clinics, all of a sudden disappears, because your cost to have someone prepared to treat one of your client's injuries goes down by literally a factor of 1,000. So in choosing what to innovate, they don't always have to be big cost holes, right? They don't have to be a bucket that you just dump money into. There are efficiency innovations that, as Tricia pointed out, are not necessarily expensive, but can have a very significant impact in the business. I do believe that if you're in a company that believes that innovation and what we've always done can't exist together, there's really a problem. Right? It's not either or, it's not black or white. It's the fact that you can contribute some of what your overall company is working on towards innovation. And that may vary based on your strategic plan, good years versus bad years. But having the idea that you will always have some part of something that's looking towards innovation is critical.
Yeah, placing those bets and looking forward is really important. And Kent, what would you like to add to this?
No, I mean, I have two things from Chris's comments going through my mind. The one, if they're not telling you it's impossible, it's probably not really innovation, but also this juxtaposition in the process. And I remember early in my career, we were having a meeting about like the waste in the magazine print runs. Like we had a good year, we only had to recycle 1.1% or, you know, something like that. And I said, well, why can't it be zero? Like, can't we find a way to have a process that has no waste? And now when I want to give, you know, some magazines to a nonprofit, we actually have to schedule the print. There aren't overruns to be just given away. And, you know, that's an operations team doing incredible innovation within an existing process to find a way to make that happen. And I think so. I love innovations within process. I think the other thing I'd add is sometimes when the bet's too big for us, and sometimes it might not be a bet just about money, it might be about time or the risk of building the organizational capacity, not just the spend. You know, we rely on partnerships. So when I talk to you about using technology to reach kids all over the world, a lot of that we do with companies where their DNA is really about technology platforms, and we understand our value, and we try to look through the lens of the customer empathy. What do we want to have occur? What does that customer need? And if we bring two companies together, we can de-risk the innovation, and maybe we get a little bit less of the pie. It might ultimately make us less profitable long-term, but our biggest risk is whether or not the customer really wants it. So speed matters a huge amount. But that's about all I have to add.
No, that's great. I want to invite the audience, if you have questions for the panel, to put them in chat, and I'll be looking here and pulling those in our last minutes of this panel. And while those questions are going to come in, I'm going to ask a few more of the group. All right, so let's see. How do you look at the level of risk of not changing? We've talked about changes, and we're presuming that it's going to happen. But what happens if we don't? And how do you assess that in your organization? Chris, I'll start with you on that.
Sure. There are only two directions for a business. You're either growing or you're dying. And if part of that growth is not directed towards innovation, you're really just going to slowly taper off until the business isn't what it once was. And so you really have to be pushing for growth and uncomfortable growth, or you will just become irrelevant. And sometimes you can become irrelevant very quickly, right? Things seem like they've been going well for the last 4 generations, and this whole internet thing started. And all of a sudden, a whole bunch of businesses were no longer relevant, right? Those types of changes do happen, and they happen in all industries. And so constantly having your focus partially devoted to, well, what's coming next is going to keep you from that slow deterioration of the business.
Tricia, do you think that innovation needs to provide an immediate impact for us to declare it successful?
No, I think often we fail and it's still successful. And in fact, I think that's, you know, as long as you learn from anything you try that's innovative, you know, over the course of this panel, I've been thinking through many of the different innovations that we've attempted that haven't gone anywhere. And yet we've learned, we've adjusted in trying to anticipate, like Chris says, where's the market or the industry going next? Of course, you try things that don't actually end up working for the customer or solving a problem that you thought that they had. And I think immediate impact, even your best innovations often take some time to see the real results. And then it's really fun to watch the results you couldn't have anticipated from that innovation kind of blossom and bloom as well.
Dovetailing off of that, Kent, has your company failed in any way in these innovation ideas, and how was it treated in that failure?
We don't have nearly enough time to talk about our failures. There's so many. Like when I first came in, I was like, we should have mall kiosks. And I found myself 4 months in, like running a mall kiosk in Greater Columbus to see how this would work. We grew that to 10 kiosks across the country, and we really learned that was not going to work. And we've run toy catalogs. We have so many things that have failed, but I think just as Tricia said, the question is, can you take learnings from them? Do you have the fortitude to really look in the mirror and say, why did that fail? And what does that tell us about either the strength of our brand? What insight does it give us about something else that could work? So I tend to think we have more failures than successes. We just we don't talk about them publicly. Like that's not what our PR people want to share. But if you're not failing and if you're not creating a culture, and I'm still working at this. I mean, our culture's not as excellent as I want it to be, and how it manages the failures and learning from failures and the resilience to, pull the plug early. If it's not working. One of the things that's tough about a mission-driven company and an optimistic company, you sometimes believe what you're trying to do is so important, you ignore when it's not working. You keep investing, you keep going. So there's a discipline about you've got to go far enough to make sure you've learned, but you have to be willing to call it a failure, move on, and try something else. You want to get as many at-bats as you can and make sure you're learning from each one, and creating that culture. And I think culture is a key for me.
So one quick question for each of you, and then we'll go to the last question. We'll wrap up the panel. Measurement. What do you measure on innovation? Chris?
Sure. So measuring for innovation is about client acceptance if it's going to be an outward-facing product. In other words, did what we build as an innovation actually resonate with our clients? If we're talking about improvements or innovations that largely affect us in-house in our process, we're going to be tracking the cost to accomplish certain tasks, if that's what we're focused on in the process. And that often just becomes a time, dollars, and cents calculation.
Tricia, how about for you?
Sure. It depends on the type of innovation. Sometimes it's, before you implement the innovation, you want to know how's it going to affect quality, how's it going to affect price, all those things. And we'll set up a whole suite of measures to know whether it's succeeding or failing. But I also would be remiss if I didn't say there are some that are softer. Some of the innovations matter to me most because they make my top teammates who are younger enthusiastic about continuing with Robinson. And I'm like, all right, that's worth it. They're going to find something that works eventually. So I'll keep going down that path too. So sometimes it's just people are happy.
And that's important too, especially in the times of the great resignation, right?
Yep.
And Kent, how about for you? How about measurements over at Highlights?
Yeah, no, I'd eco both of those things. Like Chris said, they're standard business cases. You got to look at the math, what's happening in the numbers. I think it's also cultural. For me, I'm so paranoid of how we're losing either product categories or channels. I'm always looking at, is it opening something new? Is there some aspect that this becomes extendable? Because everything's under attack all the time. If we're not opening up new channels or categories or markets, we're in deep trouble, the way Chris said. So that's another metric for us. What does it open up for potential future growth?
And the last question is, if there's one word you want to leave the audience with, okay, maybe two words that you want to leave the audience with to be action oriented, get them thinking about something. What is that thing that you want to leave them with? Chris?
Actually do it.
And Tricia?
I was going with try it.
And Kent?
Focus on your purpose and your customer and do it.
Awesome. You guys, this was so fun. Thanks so much for being on. It was a joy and so nice to be together with you.